1 second. All right, now you are live.
All right, thanks, Angie. Well, welcome back, everyone. Another episode of What's the Tea? It's our weekly Facebook show for South Suburban Family Shelter. Every week at 2 p.m., we interview either a staff member or a community partner and see what's the tea and what's going on. As you can see, we have our executive director back. So, Jennifer, how are you today?
I'm good. I told Zach I would only do this episode if we could open up by saying, "May the 4th be with you." So all my friends out there, have a good day. I have my Star Wars gear on, but you just can't see it. But trust me, I'm appropriate.
We will take your word for it.
Mm-hmm.
So May is Mental Health Awareness Month, so we're going to weave in those kind of topics throughout the month. And today in particular, we're going to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic a little bit and how that overlaps with trauma and mental health and stress. So that's kind of what I wanted to start with. Jennifer has been doing a webinar series, which is just had its second week, based on Dr. Bruce Perry's series about these same topics. So could you tell us a little bit about what's going on with that series and why you decided to do it?
Yeah, so we have pulled together. I have to thank your supervisor, Carrie. She reviewed some of the episodes with me. There's a whole lot of them that Dr. Perry recorded at the beginning of the pandemic, and we have distilled that down to just a little over a handful of episodes. But Dr. Perry does a really great job diving into some different specific ways of discussing trauma and related specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic, and from his experience, sort of what he expected to see and what kinds of things that he thinks those in helping professions need to be prepared for. And he's I always say he's a pretty heady guy, like he's, extremely academic and cerebral. So I always find that material is much easier to start to understand and break down when you can talk about it with other people and tease out what the learning is from that, and how you can apply that to your practical daily life and your practical work. So the idea behind doing the series was to be able to gather people together to not only hear the great information that he has to share, which anyone can access. He thankfully recorded these and put them out for free, but our opportunity is then, okay, so what does it all mean? What does this all mean, and how can we use it in our work, and then also for ourselves?
And that's kind of how you format it, right? You with the video part, and then kind of breaking it down and kind of making sense of it, and what does it mean for service providers, and what does it mean for us, seeing clients directly and doing our work day to day.
Yeah, so we start every episode with, watching the session that was recorded, and we're kind of learning, after doing it 2 times, kind of how do we want to break it down the best. So I always review them, kind of pull out the pieces that are salient to me and some questions I have. And then in this last one, we started kind of taking some stills. He has a lot of models that he puts together to try to explain his language. So we put those up to look at them together and kind of break it down a little bit more into those understandable pieces and figure out, how do we apply this to the people that we're working with, and then also ourselves. So essentially, I asked people to think about how this applies to yourself, the people that you're working with, and then organizationally, because that's another place that's important to think of, is organizations as living, breathing, structures that are also impacted.
And so if someone wanted to find these videos, I believe you could just search Dr. Bruce Perry COVID-19 stress on YouTube, and you'll likely get the first link.
Yes, I think it pops up a couple of, that's usually where I find them. I just Google it every time, and there's a specific link that he has. And there were so many, almost 20, I think, all together. And there's some other links kind of buried into his website that you can go into. But I listened to them all, I think maybe back, it's probably been about a year. And they're just fascinating. I mean, I love Dr. Bruce Perry. So to me, I was very happy, listening to all of them. But I just think that they're really fascinating and helpful, and it grounds you in what you're doing. So I think sometimes, we're all in this pandemic together, which is something that's unique for many service providers, because not often are you experiencing the exact same trauma that the people you're working with are experiencing at the same time. Usually it's, that's not the case. So it's a different place for people to be coming from.
Yeah, that is very true. I didn't think of it like that. Um, and the thing with the series, I think you had mentioned that you were watching it as this pandemic was unfolding, and I was just struck by how it was like a voice of reason and very clear information when everything was so just uncertain. And now looking back, watching it a second time, a year later, I mean, it holds up perfectly, which is
Mhm.
which is really good to see.
It's interesting and scary and a little bit sad. So some of the things that he predicted that would happen, I'm definitely seeing happen, and they have played out that kind of way. But it's interesting because I realize one of the things that I do when I'm experiencing stress and overwhelm is knowledge helps me to calm down. So the more that I know about something, the better I feel. It gives me, probably a false sense, but some sense that I have control over what's happening. So I realize that's kind of a go-to. So it helped me, listening to the series, be able to kind of make sense of things and ground myself a little bit.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And so as you were watching the series for the first time, think back sometime last year, um, what sorts of things were you taking from the Lexus series where you were applying it to the way that you approach your work at South Suburban Family Shelter?
So a lot of it was around, he really emphasizes the need for connection for people, which resonates greatly with me, because when I do trainings on trauma, I always use a definition of trauma that Judith Herman created. And it talks about how trauma is the loss of control, connection, and meaning.
Mm,
And so the way that he talks about connection being crucial to the human experience is a thread that goes throughout that. So I think that I was, from my position, always kind of aware of how is the agency staying connected to each other through staffing, how are staff trying to stay connected to the clients that they've been serving, and trying to figure out ways that we can do that. And then also when he talks a lot about being regulated, or being able to stay regulated, or to your calm space, as much as one possibly can, and how do we create the conditions that allow people to do that. So I think that was a piece that was always had been on my mind, trying to anticipate where people were at, or get a sense of where people were at within our agencies and in the community, and trying to think about, how can we um, help people to be as calm, or, again, have as much control over what's going on as possible. How can we help replicate that, knowing that we can't control the pandemic? There's so many things out of our control, but what can we control?
yeah, and I will say that the messaging from South Suburban Family Shelter was definitely consistent throughout, which was nice. Of course, because you hear so many things in those early months as things unravel about well, the messaging about you're not going to be as productive. This is a shocking situation. None of us have ever been through this. Um, you were making videos, you were sending all staff messages. Could you talk a little bit about that messaging, kind of how you were approaching with your staff?
Yeah. So I have to think back and hope I don't get triggered while I'm doing it, because it was certainly probably the most difficult time of my entire career trying to figure out how to navigate that. And of course, it wasn't something that I did alone. So our directors team, we had to kind of predict what was coming before the stay-at-home order happened, and had a couple of really long, multi-hour meetings. But the one thing that we all really agreed upon, and that was our team as a leadership team, but also the board of directors, in being a support. To the whole organization, was that we really needed to focus on the health and wellness of our staff. And what we've always known is, the staff and the employees are our greatest asset, and the services that we provide are only as good as how we treat our employees. And when you're talking about trauma, there is no way that any client of any kind coming to South Suburban Family Shelter is going to get the experience we want them to get if our staff are in a place of extreme trauma and concern. It's normal for people to have to pull back and focus on themselves. And so that's what we were trying to figure out. How can we have that be okay? What can we do to make sure that our staff can do what they need to do for themselves and their families, so that then they are able to help the people that are still able to come to us for services. So that was really a driving force in trying to figure out how we moved through things.
And you prefaced it earlier. You had said it was the first time that the staff was experiencing the same trauma as the clients, along with the additional whatever the clients were facing. So, just generally speaking, and I know you've kind of said it, but would you classify COVID-19, this entire uncertain pandemic, as a trauma? Because probably prior to this, when we're thinking about trauma, that's, we're not thinking of that as a typical example. But of course, this is a very untypical situation to be in.
So yes, I do. And I tell everyone that yes, this global pandemic is a traumatic event. It's a collective global traumatic event. So no longer will I be at a training and ask people to raise their hand if they've experienced a trauma. I will tell them, you all have now experienced trauma. Because at a certain point during the pandemic, people did not know if going to the grocery store could kill them. I mean, quite frankly, we did not know. We knew that people were dying. There were so many things that we didn't know about how that could happen, or when it could happen, or who was really the most vulnerable. We haven't, within our lifetimes, within my lifetime, been told that I have to stay home and not go anywhere. Because of what it, and so not only did we not know that, but it actually happened to people. Over 500,000 people in the United States have died, and that impacted people that we know. Our staff at South Suburban Family Shelter, a significant number of our staff lost family members and friends. So in and of itself, losing a loved one is traumatic grief.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you think about those early days of people stockpiling food and toilet paper and all those things. I mean,
That's
truly,
a fear-based response, right?
100%. It's absolutely not knowing, overwhelming your sense of and your model of the world, and not knowing really kind of what to do about it or how to respond to it.
Yeah, and again, if we
So
go back
short.
to that idea of, having a loss of control, connection, and meaning, we lost control over all kinds of things. Like there was anything that we really felt like we had control over. Our connections were just completely severed, and for some people that was okay, but for a lot of people that was extremely difficult. Even when we talk about, folks who got sick or passed away, not being able to have their family with them. And then being a family member, knowing that is happening to your loved one and you're not able to be there with them. And then not being able to have your rituals around grief that you normally would have. These are extremely significant experiences because we need those. Ritual is another thing that that we need that helps us to find closure, and it helps us to feel connected to other people during that time. And folks couldn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, on a personal level, I found my limits of introversion during this pandemic. Like, I'm fairly introverted, but even at a certain point,
I thought at one point I might like join a club or do something after this because I kind of got the same way. But I have to tell you that I've recently been invited to join an adult kickball club, and I'm like, I really don't think I can do it.
still can't do it.
I love the idea of it and I appreciate it, but I'm like, what is my energy going to be like by Friday evening? So I thought it would make me be a joiner, and it's not.
That's fair. And also with ritual, I think it's just our daily patterns as well. And I think we'll throw up a visual here soon about stability and um, as a way to buffer against uncertainty. But just our daily patterns were disrupted too. Daily commutes, meals, getting kids off to school. Some people were laid off, and that's disruptive.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's, the daily pattern. It's really important to highlight that, um, because I think that's something that we take for granted. I think that we take for granted sort of like that daily routine and what it does for us until it's completely gone. And when there were memes that were like, it's mustard or what, you couldn't figure out what day it was of, Mavril of whatever, because people just completely lost like this typical sense of time because that routine and that structure was gone. But it's about predictability, and predictability makes us humans feel safe. And we don't always realize that, but that, I'm going to wake up between, 7 and 7:30 in the morning, and I'm going to get my coffee, and I'm going to, I have, I'm going to get the coffee, and then I'm going to take the shower, and then I'm going to do this. And these certain ways that you move through the day, people take for granted the, what that does for you, being able to predict and know. And that's one of the work of children. So it's kind of funny to see like it's important to you as an adult and it's essential to children. So when a child is watching the same show for the 100,000th time, and you as the caregiver are so sick and tired of seeing it, but that's the work of the child to master that program. It's good for them once they can predict everything that's happening in that show. That provides them, a sense of mastery over what it is, that they're watching and able to predict. And so that's what those, little daily routines do for us that probably didn't realize they were doing for us until they were gone.
Yeah, you really find out what kind of habits you have, and 'cause that's really what we fall back to when when these events happen. So I kind of want to stay with this and maybe talk a little bit about the first lecture of your series, which was about stress and predictability. Um, and we've gotten we've circled around the topic a little bit. So I kind of want to ask, because stress, I don't think it's necessarily good or harmful because it's context based. So can you help us distinguish what is harmful stress and what is useful and kind of necessary for daily life stress, and kind of
Yes.
what's the difference there?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. And here's the visual that you were talking about, because I think it's really helpful to see this. And one of the participants in the series, when we did the first one, and I asked, did anything surprise you when you were watching this? And somebody did point out, like, I never thought stress could be good. I've only ever thought about stress as something that's negative. So this is Dr. Perry's, simplified slide that he shows when he talks about a pattern of stress. And he talks about it in relation to resilience, your ability to tolerate when difficult or stressful, strenuous, challenging things kind of happen. And I love how he points out, I'm going to try to see if I can use the fun annotation tools here, because I talk with my hands. And so I'm going to use, so he talks about, how different kinds of stress can lead to sensitizing you or vulnerability. And really throughout the whole series, he kind of emphasizes how folks who are already vulnerable, how the impact of the pandemic was going to be so much more negative for them. But then how stress can also help build tolerance. So again, it gets this, oh, I didn't even know that word was in there. See, the word of predictability, if it's something predictable, if it's moderate, so it's not, too much, and something that you can have a little bit of control over. So here you really are kind of seeing the difference between, if trauma is having a sense of loss of connection, control, and meaning, you're seeing that if you have some control over something, you're able to tolerate it and build your resilience. So the example that he provides is if you're going to school, which is like a relatable example. Everyone goes to school and they're introducing a new concept. So, say you're a kid or whatever, they're introducing division and you've never done division before. So you're going to have some anxiety over a concept that's new. You're not sure if you're going to understand it, but the idea is that it's coming. Your teacher's telling you, we're going to learn this new concept. We're going to give it to you moderately. We're going to give it to you bit by bit, introduce this piece and this piece and this piece. And all of that is happening in a controlled environment. Makes it easier for you to tolerate it. You start to learn it a little bit. You start to master it a little bit, and then you build resiliency. So the next time a new concept comes up, you're more likely to be like, okay, this is how this is going to go. It's going to go, little by little. And I think I can do it because I've done it before. But it's still stress. It's just like starting a new job. It's stressful. You're excited about it, but you're still a little stressed about it because you don't really know what's going to happen. The way we tend to talk about stress is more so on this side of it, where it's, it comes out of nowhere. And it seems to be overwhelming right from the bat. It's extreme and it's prolonged. It either is happening for a long time, or it feels like at least that it's happening for a very long time. And it can make you more hyper alert, more sensitized, and lead to a vulnerability because you're lacking that control over what's going to happen. So kind of the two different ways that stress can play out. But when you look at COVID-19, it was definitely falling over on this side of, right, because it was unpredictable. Yes, it was extreme. People are dying of it. It's prolonged so much longer than we even thought it was going to be. Even when it was first introduced, or we first realized what it was, even thinking that this was going to last 3 or 4 months felt overwhelming. And here we are.
Yeah, more
over
than
a year
anything,
later.
I just think prolonged is just the one that stands out to me the most. Thinking about how that overlaps with, like, there was a perfect example of school stress, and so maybe you've got both of these going on at the same time, but if you don't have boundaries for your day, for example, and your work day or your school day is bleeding into your relaxing time, then you've got this prolonged stress. And if you have a breakdown of your routine for getting to work or getting your kids to school, then you're losing your predictability, and everything is kind of starting to resemble just the COVID-19 stress.
Right. And I think what a lot of people have experienced, so some people were already sensitive and vulnerable to begin with. So this really, he has I'm just going to draw it here. He has another place, like a visual that sort of looks like this. And that if you're a sensitized person, your arc is kind of more over on this side, and how he predicts that folks that were already on this vulnerable side were going to spike even higher in what their vulnerability was going to look like, because his prediction was that the the types of help that might have been identified weren't going to get to people fast enough. And I think that that was the case. I mean, I really think that that is what we have seen. And we're even seeing it right now with the vaccine rollout. And essentially, it's inequity. So people who have already experienced an inequitable world and have been impacted by that, there wasn't anything about the COVID-19 experience that straightened out that inequity.
And
Yeah.
and kind of in relation to that, I kind of wanted to mention something that I heard Dr. Bruce Perry say in the series, which is that resilience is not a character trait the way that we often think about it, where it's really about the inequities and the different types of stress and traumas that we face, if I'm understanding it correctly. And if you're constantly exposed to unpredictable, extreme, and prolonged stress and trauma, it's not that you don't have resilience, it's just your exposure. And it's unrealistic to just expect that someone has this hard resilience to something like that.
Well, I like the way that you have to have opportunities to build resilience, is the way that he talks about it. Um, so if these things are not really ever part of the equation in your world, you lose the opportunity to build the resilience. So everyone has the potential to. However, you have to have certain factors in place, and you have to be able to kind of, you know, overcome or master a stressor, um, is the way that I hear him kind of talk about it, to have that. So, and I think the other thing on top of it, we're very early into his series, so he's recording these in March. And most of this is talking about COVID-19, but the reality of our world is that COVID-19 is not the only trauma that we've experienced collectively over the last year. So we started with having COVID-19, but that then move into approximately this time as of last year when George Floyd was murdered, and the media attention around that, and then the subsequent media attention around a lot of the police killings of Black folks through the United States has added a whole other layer of trauma in a broader scale. So it's layering on top of folks. And then in addition to that, the election that took place in November was incredibly contentious. And that again, I think some folks really experienced some things related to that in a way that is traumatic. So there's just layer upon layer upon layer. I had done a training for another organization, and their staff thankfully really reminded me of the crisis around immigration that had been taking place over the last couple of years, and the trauma related to that. So when we were really in the midst of multiple large scale um, traumatic experiences.
Yeah, just really wondering when will this end? When will we get some kind of some kind of conclusion to any of it? And it's I think we're at least getting a conclusion somewhat on the pandemic end with the vaccines rolling out. So that's a positive. But yeah, as you're saying, when these things start to layer on each other, I mean, everyone knows this, that sums up the entire last year. But unpredictable, uncontrollable, and prolonged.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's extremely overwhelming. So I know a lot of people, myself included, um, definitely had started to get to a place of just feeling impotent. I can't make anything better. Nothing that I do is going to make a difference. This is all so huge. What good can I do? Or there being so many things that you want to contribute to in a meaningful way. but not being able to identify necessarily how to do that, which is, why one of the recommendations is to reduce your media exposure,
I've had
because
to do
that
that.
that has really sensitized quite a few people.
Yeah, and just from a personal experience, that's what I've had to do a little bit. I find even after like 5, 10 minutes of just hearing everything that's going on, I could feel the tension just rise very quickly. And I guess it's a personal balance that you have to strike on what exposure you want and what types of information you're exposing yourself to, because we can't always do something about what we're hearing.
Right. And I think, for people in our field, we're doing the work that we do because we come from a place of wanting to help others. So it's particularly overwhelming when you've got that as a driving force in you, and there's so much that you see to help, but you feel like you can do so little. So it is really important for folks to have been able to, and still, kind of identify what is the thing that I can do, what can I reasonably, focus on, right now in this moment that will do some good. And also I think to keep in mind that it's not going to happen overnight. Change, the types of change that we're looking for isn't going to happen overnight. And even with the COVID-19 pandemic, we all had to get to a point where we understood this isn't going away in 3 or 6 months. This is a long haul
It's
type
not,
of
yeah,
thing.
it's not going to be done by Easter 2020 or everything else that we had hoped or heard that we were hoping for. And one of your final episodes is about self-care on both a personal level and a organizational level, right?
Yes, I really like that one.
I almost want to open it up, but I I think we might open up a can of worms if we start going into the whole dynamic of that. But it I guess we could say self-care is one of these main solutions. It maybe not a solution to the whole problem, but as we had started the conversation with, if we can't help ourselves and if we can't get to ourselves and our staff to a better place, it's going to be hard to help others.
Yes, I mean, I think the one about that episode, the big takeaway, so to speak, is the concept that organizations have a responsibility, um, to create a space where staff are able to take care of themselves, and also that it's a collective responsibility. So self-care isn't, you go over there and do your self-care. It's a collective, responsibility that as an organization that is dedicated to trauma-informed care, it's our responsibility to provide space and encouragement, and opportunity for staff to be able to do that. And what does that look like? I think that's just a different way of approaching it than people are used to thinking of.
Yeah, I think so. Especially from a work perspective, a lot of I think prior to the pandemic, it seemed like self-care was a theme, like something that you would do after work, you would do at nights and on the weekends. But just as we've explaining all these additional stressors, and COVID was the whole context of everything last year, and it needed to be integrated into the workday when it was necessary.
I really hope that people do learn from it, how important that is, to continue doing that, with staff and within organizations to the extent that you're able to do that. Because I know that we did, I'm in the meetings with our administrators team, and we just, we increased the cadence of our meetings so that we were meeting more often. And some of the meetings, all the meeting was just, how are you? What are you, how are you? What's going on? What do you need to talk about? How have you been coping this week? What's one new thing you've started to do? And, what have you stopped doing that you used to do every day? And just kind of processing through it for the first couple of months.
we had several of those meetings as well where, you know, it's on the agenda, it's work updates, and after about 45 minutes we say, well, let's keep on the topics of our personal updates, because that's really what's actually going to move us forward and be able to get to that stuff.
Yeah, you know, most of us cried in the meeting at one point, if not at multiple points during the meeting, because it was just so much. And, you know, that was true. It was just we until you can get that kind of stuff out and know that you're supported, you just can't, there's just no way you're going to be able to function well, you know, in the rest of your work.
Absolutely. So I would like to check in with Angie and see what's going on with Facebook, if we have any questions.
Yes. So the first question, in the first two sessions of this webinar, have there been any observations shared that have stood out to you? Can you share a teaser for content you are particularly looking forward to covering in the rest of the series?
Oh my gosh, is there anything that has stuck out to me? I don't know that there's been anything that has surprised me necessarily, but I do think that it's definitely information that people are able to kind of look at how it impacted them personally, and then also kind of flip it and say, and now here's, you know, here's how I'm doing it with my work. And definitely some pieces that really good reminders um, for people. And I think that have been doing the work for a little while, oh yeah, you know, that is where people are at, that is where people are coming from. So that's been good. As far as teasers going through, I can think of what the next one is. Next week is fun because we're talking about emotional contagion. So again, there's going to be another, this theme of regulation kind of runs through the whole thing. So it's certain, you know, how you match um, how one person is responding to the situation and how the other person is responding, and sort of how this concept of a dysregulated person can never regulate another dysregulated person. So this idea of how it is that you interact with one another during these stressful times, which has been very interesting, like I said, with COVID-19 and the other traumas that we've experienced. Because, you know, you can be in a therapy session with someone who's talking to you about how concerned they are about COVID-19, and as the therapist, you're like, I know, me too, you know, because you're there at the same time. But that's not, you can't do that, you know, in the session. So it's interesting. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm really looking forward to wrapping up with organizational care. I can't think off the top of my head. I didn't print out the list of all of the topics that are in front of me, but the other piece that I'm interested in really unpacking is he talks a lot about how the brain functions from the bottom up. And when he uses, I didn't even have it on here to possibly share, but really talking about essentially how you've got the lower functions of the brain, and kind of learning how to regulate is something that happens early, all the way up to cognitive, which is more, you know, when you're talking about like cognitive behavioral therapy or talk therapy, and really thinking things through and how they have to kind of happen in a certain type of order. And for me, when I have been listening to and studying the way that he talks about this, it always makes me think of Maslow's hierarchy of need, which I have started to pull out. You all might notice I started talking about it more and pulling it out more over the last year, because it almost lines up to me. In that there's really basic needs that we have to have met as humans in order to be able to kind of move up in that hierarchy. And it sort of matches up to me in that kind of, in that sort of sense of what you can accomplish in terms of the brain development. You know, you have really basic things that you need to do before you can move up. And so I'm really interested in being able to talk with the group about what the implications are with that, in terms of how we work with people that come to engage in our services, and really compared to what the traditional expectation is of people seeking services, and what's expected for us kind of as an agency to produce, you know, from this whole sort of like, how do you know you've helped somebody, and what people's preconceived notions are of what that's going to look like as compared to what it actually it will look like. I'm not sure if that was a very clear answer.
No, I believe it was definitely a clear answer. And then another one is, what types of things can we do to refill our reservoirs of resilience?
Oh, that's such a really good question. I almost think like setting yourself up for successes, taking on challenges, but ones that you've got some confidence that you can accomplish, because that's the idea about resilience, something that is going to be hard to do, but you can set yourself up with the tools you need to be able to get it done, so that you've got that sense of accomplishment. You've gone through the stress of it. It's definitely challenging, but you're able to master it at the end. Any ideas you have, Zach?
I was thinking along the same lines, building slowly up to something, and getting those small wins, and having something that's controllable and manageable, and then increasing, um, I think can go a long way. Kind of build some momentum, and not overwhelm yourself, so to speak, with trying to be overly resilient, but something that's manageable and a bit of a challenge versus something that's I forget what the word is, more like a huge aspirational challenge.
Yes, I'm feeling the running is life metaphor again in here, because you set yourself a goal, be it a 5K, 10K, whatever, and you make sure you've got yourself a plan, and you slowly kind of build up to doing that. But part of that is building in that rest. So that makes me think about the importance of putting rest into whatever your challenge is, and that giving yourself those opportunities to rest is just as important as whatever it is that you're working towards. So that's another piece in thinking about building resilience, is that it isn't go, 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 go all the time. It is being able to recognize when you have to stop and take a rest, and recover, that recovery piece, before you move forward. That's extremely important.
All right. Anything else from Facebook, Angie?
No, that is all.
All right. Thank you, Angie. Yeah, and I think recognizing those symptoms of burnout, it's it's like I attended many trainings and things like that kind of before COVID had hit, and kind of talking about recognizing them, but it was this past year where it's like those things really mattered, and learning about those things really mattered, because I don't know if I would have always been able to recognize them. Sometimes you just think you're feeling irritable, or you're feeling, you can think it's so many things, but you can think it's you're not doing your job right. You can think you're falling behind, you're not pushing yourself hard enough. But if you're not recognizing signs of burnout, you can really blame yourself. And
Yeah, burnout is a that's a tough one in our society, because we're very much we get a lot of messages, um, that you have to keep going, and that's how you're successful, and that's what the tough and the strong people do. So I do think that it tends to be almost radical sometimes to take rest, to intentionally take rest, and rest meaning like really not doing anything, like really putting your phone away, really not checking your work email, like fully walking away from it for a set period of time. It really goes against the grain.
it really does. I think this is the first time I had really heard different messaging around, in the general public. We hear it in our world, and counseling and social work and DV. We hear about self-care a little bit more, but not in the general public as much as I've heard this year, which is good, because ironically I found that you become even more productive when you give yourself the proper rest and everything like that.
You do. You open up your brain for creativity. So it was some point earlier this year. I started listening to books on tape this year. That was a new thing for me. And I've always been wanting to read Trauma Stewardship, but never got around to reading it. So I listened to it. But that was one of the things that the author was talking about in related to burnout and vicarious trauma, is having less energy kind of zaps the ability for that creativity to happen. And I was like, yes, like it resonated with me so much because people don't have the ability to do that. And so I'm just thinking about, the trickle down effect to that. And, one of the things we hear on an organizational level when you're in spaces that you're dealing with funding is all of these, funders and philanthropists that want to give you money, always like, we want the new innovative idea. So when I'm listening there, I was like, we can't be innovative because we're stressed out. We're burnt out and there's no room for this creativity that you want people to happen. So how about you fund R&D if you want research and development, wouldn't that be amazing, right? If nonprofits could actually have funding to just to have people who are able to have that space to think about those creative ideas and approaches, because we don't have that. But I thought that was amazing. That was the first time I ever heard anyone talk about how it impacts that ability to be creative.
Yeah, it does. And you have to do your routine tasks first, of course, before you start creating new ones. And by the time you get there, it's you might not have anything left in the tank by that
Well,
time.
and that's why the time for yourself is so, I mean, I've got to tell you that idea about like, this Maslow's hierarchy and this Bruce Perry talking about the brain, that came to me in the middle of a run because I was just, my brain was nowhere and, was kind of open and it just kind of floated in there. You have to be able to have times where that can happen.
I think I find the best ideas come from walking and running, just generally speaking.
Yeah, we're gonna do an infomercial to get
Yeah.
people running and walking. I do too. For me, it feels like the best way I can kind of describe it is like a moving meditation. I'm not a person who's gonna necessarily sit and meditate. But for me, when I'm running, even, with the music blaring in my ears, there gets to be certain points where I don't hear the music anymore. I don't, hear, the running app tell me how far I've been, like it comes and goes, but it's just, it is much more of a meditative like state, which there's actually one of the webinars that Dr. Perry has is on sports and talks really specifically about how sport supports people with traumatic experiences and some of kind of like the repetition and the routine of the movements and that kind of stuff, what it does, for the brain. And I was like, oh, look, there's science behind it.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of play therapy and especially just being a lot, being inside the house and everything where, you get real stiff and you feel stuck, and it's just good to move around a little bit and see what the mind does.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I'm really glad we got to talk about a little bit about the Bruce Perry series. If anyone's interested in kind of taking a deeper dive into some of the topics and joining kind of a group of people on a discussion, they're happening on Thursdays, and the next one is in 2 days, right? At 10 o'clock.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So we'll get some information in the comments about that. So if you're interested in that, we'll have a link for you. And was there anything else that you wanted to mention or talk about for today?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think we covered a lot.
Well, thank you for being a return guest once again, and looking forward to hearing about the rest of these topics. And for everyone who's listening, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Next week, we're going to talk about Mother's Day a little bit and kind of have a discussion around that. So that should be very interesting. And we'll be here, same place and time, with different tea.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.